December 7, 1941 marked the day the Pacific Ocean transformed into a battlefield that would reshape the course of human history. The sun had barely risen over Pearl Harbor when Japanese aircraft descended like steel vultures, ripping through the morning calm with bombs that shattered not just ships, but America's isolationist dreams. Within 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, and California settling into the harbor's depths, while over 2,000 American servicemen perished in the inferno. The attack, meticulously planned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, represented the culmination of Japan's imperial ambitions that had been festering since the Meiji Restoration decades earlier. The Japanese Empire had spent the 1930s expanding across Asia with terrifying efficiency. Manchuria fell in 1931, followed by deeper incursions into China throughout the decade. By 1940, imperial forces occupied French Indochina, positioning themselves like a coiled serpent, ready to strike southward toward the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. Emperor Hirohito's government envisioned the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemism for Japanese dominance stretching from the Indian Ocean to the mid-Pacific. The empire needed oil, rubber, tin, and rice to fuel its war machine, resources that Britain, France, and the Netherlands controlled in their colonial territories. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had watched this expansion with growing alarm. American economic sanctions followed Japanese aggression, culminating in an oil embargo that threatened to strangle Japan's military capabilities within months. Tokyo faced a stark choice: withdraw from conquered territories or seize the resources by force. They chose war, believing America lacked the will to fight a prolonged Pacific campaign while Europe burned under Nazi occupation. The weeks following Pearl Harbor witnessed Japanese forces sweeping across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with shocking speed. Guam fell on December 10, 1941. Wake Island's valiant defenders held out until December 23. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. The supposedly impregnable British fortress of Singapore, defended by 85,000 troops, capitulated on February 15, 1942, what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Philippines, defended by combined American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur, crumbled despite desperate resistance on the Bataan Peninsula. According to military historians at the United States Naval Institute, the Japanese captured territory at a pace unprecedented in modern warfare, securing an empire spanning over 3 million square miles within 6 months. The fall of the Philippines particularly stung American pride. MacArthur's evacuation to Australia on March 11, 1942, accompanied by his famous vow, "I shall return," left 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners to endure the Bataan Death March, where thousands perished from brutality, starvation, and disease during the forced journey to prison camps. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma's jungles to the Solomon Islands, from the Aleutians' frozen waters to Java's tropical shores. Their defensive perimeter seemed impenetrable, protected by thousands of miles of ocean and fortified islands. Tokyo's military planners believed America would negotiate peace rather than pay the blood price required to reclaim each occupied territory. They fundamentally misunderstood their enemy's resolve and underestimated American industrial might that would soon turn the Pacific into Japan's graveyard. June 4th through 7th, 1942 witnessed the Battle of Midway, where 6 months of Japanese victories collided with American determination and broke against the shoals of strategic miscalculation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, possessed a decisive advantage the Japanese never suspected. American cryptanalysts had cracked Japan's naval codes. When Admiral Yamamoto dispatched his armada to capture Midway Island, Nimitz knew the enemy's entire plan, including the location of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. The battle unfolded like a deadly chess match played across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway's installations on the morning of June 4th, holding back his reserve aircraft. When American scout planes reported enemy carriers, Nagumo faced a commander's nightmare. His flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed, fuel lines exposed, bombs scattered about. American dive bombers from carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, chose that precise moment to attack. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, transformed into flaming coffins. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that crippled Yorktown before American aircraft found and destroyed her that afternoon. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and many of her most experienced pilots in a single day. The battle shifted the Pacific War's momentum irreversibly. Japan retained numerical superiority in many categories, but she had lost the strategic initiative and would never regain it. The victory at Midway provided breathing space, but American planners faced a sobering reality. Japan occupied thousands of islands across the Pacific, many fortified and garrisoned. A direct approach toward the Japanese home islands, capturing every defended position along the way, would take decades and cost millions of lives. The United States military establishment, led by Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, needed a new strategy. That strategy emerged from the brilliant, controversial mind of General Douglas MacArthur and the methodical planning of Admiral Nimitz: island hopping. The concept revolutionized amphibious warfare doctrine. Rather than assault every Japanese-held island, American forces would capture strategically important positions, bypass and isolate enemy strongholds, then leapfrog forward. Isolated garrisons, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, would wither on the vine, as one American planner described it. This approach minimized American casualties while maintaining offensive momentum, allowing the United States to advance thousands of miles toward Japan, while avoiding costly frontal assaults on heavily defended positions. The strategy required unprecedented coordination between Army, Navy, and Marine forces. 2 separate command structures emerged: MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area advancing through New Guinea and the Philippines, while Nimitz's Central Pacific forces drove through the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands. This dual-axis advance forced Japan to defend everywhere while concentrating nowhere, stretching their resources across an impossible defensive perimeter. The competition between MacArthur and Nimitz occasionally created friction, but ultimately accelerated the Allied advance as each commander sought to outpace the other. Guadalcanal became the testing ground for this new strategy. On August 7, 1942, Marines landed on this obscure Solomon Islands position to prevent Japanese forces from completing an airfield that would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. What planners expected to be a brief operation transformed into a 6-month meat grinder that consumed men and ships with horrifying efficiency. Both sides poured reinforcements into the battle, fighting for control of Henderson Field with desperate ferocity that turned Guadalcanal's jungles into killing grounds and the surrounding waters into Iron Bottom Sound, where dozens of warships rest today. November 20th, 1943, brought Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, where American forces learned brutal lessons about assaulting fortified Pacific islands. The target, Betio Island, measured barely 3 miles long and 800 yards wide, a coral speck dominated by a Japanese airfield. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded 4,700 defenders who had spent months transforming Betio into a fortress bristling with coastal guns, machine gun emplacements, and obstacles designed to shred landing craft. Shibasaki boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. The 2nd Marine Division accepted his challenge on the morning of November 20th. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment preceded the assault, plastering the island with explosives that observers believed must have killed every defender. They were catastrophically wrong. Japanese fortifications, constructed from coconut logs, coral, and concrete, absorbed the punishment. When the first wave of Marines approached Red Beach, accurate enemy fire began tearing through their ranks. The assault devolved into chaos almost immediately. Naval planners had miscalculated the tides, leaving landing craft stranded on the coral reef hundreds of yards from shore. Marines abandoned their vehicles and waded toward the beach through chest-deep water, while Japanese machine guns created killing lanes that turned the lagoon red. Bodies floated among the wreckage of destroyed landing craft. Those who reached the seawall huddled behind the meager protection it offered, pinned down by withering fire from positions that seemed immune to destruction. For 76 hours, Marines fought yard by yard across Baitio's devastated landscape. Flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarters combat reduced the battle to its most primitive form: kill or be killed. Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, launching banzai charges when positions became untenable rather than surrender. American casualties mounted horrifically. Over 1,000 Marines killed and more than 2,000 wounded, capturing an island that measured less than half a square mile. Journalists accompanying the invasion shocked the American public with graphic photographs of Marines dead in the surf, forcing civilians to confront the war's brutal reality. Tarawa taught invaluable lessons despite its terrible cost. Military planners realized preliminary bombardments required longer duration and greater accuracy. Amphibious assaults needed specialized equipment: armored amphibious tractors capable of crossing coral reefs, improved naval gunfire coordination, better communications between air, sea, and ground forces. These lessons, written in blood on Baitio's beaches, would save thousands of lives in subsequent operations. The Central Pacific Drive continued into early 1944 with invasions of the Marshall Islands. Kwajalein and Eniwetok fell to American forces using tactics refined at Tarawa. The pattern repeated: massive naval bombardment, Marine and Army assaults, desperate Japanese defense, ultimate American victory. Each operation pushed the front lines closer to Japan while establishing forward bases for subsequent attacks. B-24 bombers operating from captured airfields began reaching targets previously beyond American range. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific campaign paralleled the Central Pacific advance. Fighting through New Guinea's disease-ridden jungles and coastal regions, his forces employed island hopping brilliantly, bypassing Japanese strongholds like Rabaul that held over 100,000 enemy troops. Rather than assault this fortress directly, MacArthur's forces captured surrounding positions, severing Rabaul's supply lines and rendering the garrison irrelevant. 18,000 Japanese troops remained isolated on Rabaul when the war ended, never having influenced the outcome. By mid-1944, American industrial production overwhelmed Japan's capacity to replace losses. The United States commissioned new aircraft carriers faster than Japan could train replacement pilots. American submarine warfare devastated Japanese merchant shipping, strangling the home island's access to raw materials their empire was supposed to provide. The island-hopping strategy accelerated as American forces grew stronger, while Japanese defenses weakened, compressed by tightening blockades and diminishing resources. June 15, 1944, marked the beginning of Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, bringing American forces within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. The strategic implications terrified Tokyo's military leadership. B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from Mariana's bases could reach Japan's industrial centers, transforming the war's dynamics fundamentally. Japan's navy sortied en masse to prevent this catastrophe, precipitating the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet with 9 aircraft carriers and 450 aircraft. Opposing him, Admiral Mark Mitcher led Task Force 58 with 15 fleet carriers, 900 aircraft, and 7 fast battleships. The forces clashed on June 19th in what American pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a one-sided slaughter that destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. American fighter pilots, flying superior Grumman F-6F Hellcats and backed by radar-directed fighter direction, massacred inexperienced Japanese air crews who had received abbreviated training as Japan's veteran pilots perished. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. American pilots reported shooting down enemy planes so easily it resembled target practice. By day's end, Japan had lost approximately 300 aircraft and 2 carriers to submarine attacks, while American losses totaled barely 30 aircraft. The battle shattered Japan's carrier aviation permanently. Remaining carriers would sail into future battles with minimal air groups, reduced to decoys drawing American attention from more significant threats. The Japanese Navy, once a formidable force that dominated Pacific waters, had become a shadow. The ground campaign for Saipan demonstrated the horrifying intensity island warfare had reached. 29,000 Japanese defenders, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, contested every yard of the island's 72 square miles. Marines and Army troops of the 5th Amphibious Corps fought through sugarcane fields, volcanic hills, and interconnected cave systems where Japanese soldiers created defensive positions nearly impossible to neutralize. Saito ordered his troops to fight to the death, establishing the pattern of suicidal resistance that would characterize subsequent battles. According to records from the United States Marine Corps Historical Division, the battle for Saipan claimed over 3,000 American lives and wounded more than 10,000. Japanese military casualties approached 24,000 dead, with virtually the entire garrison perishing. Even more disturbing, thousands of Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than surrender, leaping from cliffs at the island's northern end after Japanese propaganda convinced them Americans would torture and kill prisoners. Mothers threw their children from cliffs before jumping themselves, tragedies that haunted American observers who tried unsuccessfully to prevent the mass deaths. Saipan's fall on July 9, 1944, triggered political consequences in Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into war, resigned along with his entire cabinet. The Marianas' loss exposed the home islands to sustained strategic bombing, a reality Japanese leadership could no longer deny. Yet despite this catastrophic defeat, peace remained elusive. Military hardliners retained control, convinced that Japan could force a negotiated settlement by making further American advances unbearably costly. Tinian and Guam fell to American forces by August. Construction battalions, the famous Seabees, immediately began building massive airfields capable of handling B-29 bombers. By November, these silver giants began launching missions against Japanese cities, initiating a strategic bombing campaign that would reduce urban centers to ash. The island-hopping strategy had achieved its objective. American forces stood poised at Japan's doorstep, having advanced 7,000 miles from Pearl Harbor in less than 3 years. The speed of this advance stunned military observers worldwide. What had seemed an impossible task in the dark days of 1942, crossing the Pacific and defeating a determined enemy, had become reality through American industrial might, tactical innovation, and the blood of young men fighting for beaches and islands whose names they couldn't pronounce before landing there. October 20th, 1944, fulfilled General Douglas MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines when he waded ashore at Leyte Island, speaking into a microphone the words that would define his legacy. "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." The moment carried profound political and strategic significance. MacArthur's evacuation 30 months earlier had humiliated American prestige throughout Asia. His return symbolized that American power could not be permanently displaced, that liberation from Japanese occupation was possible. The Philippines campaign represented a strategic debate within American high command that had simmered for months. Admiral King and Navy planners argued for bypassing the Philippines entirely, striking directly at Formosa or even the Japanese home islands. MacArthur adamantly refused to abandon the Philippines again, arguing for moral obligation to liberate American nationals and Filipino civilians suffering under brutal Japanese occupation. President Roosevelt ultimately sided with MacArthur, recognizing the political necessity of fulfilling America's commitment to the Filipino people. The Leyte invasion triggered the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23 through 26, 1944, the largest naval battle in history, involving nearly 300 ships and hundreds of aircraft. Japanese Admiral Soemu Toyota launched Operation Shogo, committing virtually every remaining warship in a desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. The plan required 3 separate Japanese forces to converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously, catching American transports and carriers in a trap. The battle sprawled across hundreds of thousands of square miles, comprising 4 separate engagements: the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Battle off Cape Engano, and the Battle off Samar. At Surigao Strait, American battleships, many raised from Pearl Harbor's mud and restored to service, crossed the T against the Japanese Southern Force, executing the classic naval maneuver perfectly and annihilating the enemy column with devastating broadsides. The battleship Yamashiro capsized and sank, taking down nearly all her crew. Off Samar, the battle reached its most dramatic moment when Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force, including the super battleship Yamato with her 18-inch guns, surprised a group of small American escort carriers defended only by destroyers and destroyer escorts. The American ships, designated Taffy 3, faced annihilation by vastly superior forces. Yet through incredible courage, tactical improvisation, and confused Japanese command decisions, the small American vessels launched desperate attacks that convinced Kurita he faced heavier opposition. The destroyer USS Johnston charged directly at Japanese battleships, firing every gun until enemy shells dismembered her. She and 2 other destroyers sacrificed themselves, buying time for the escort carriers to escape. Leyte Gulf marked the combat debut of kamikazes, Japanese suicide aircraft that deliberately crashed into American ships. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi organized the first special attack units, recognizing that Japan's poorly trained pilots could not compete with American aviators in conventional combat. Suicide attacks offered a way to strike devastating blows with minimal training. The escort carrier St. Lo became the first major warship sunk by kamikaze on October 25th when a Zero fighter crashed through her flight deck, igniting aviation fuel and ammunition that tore the ship apart. The Battle of Leyte Gulf effectively destroyed the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Japan lost virtually all remaining naval aviation capability. American losses, while significant, 3 carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort, paled in comparison. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again challenge American control of Pacific waters. The ground campaign for Leyte dragged through December 1944, as Japanese reinforcements poured onto the island despite American air superiority. Monsoon rains transformed battlefields into swamps, where men fought in mud that sometimes reached their waists. The Japanese 35th Army, commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the conqueror of Singapore, defended tenaciously, but American firepower and logistics proved overwhelming. By year's end, Leyte was secure, providing bases for the liberation of Luzon and the rest of the Philippine archipelago. February 19, 1945 dawned clear and cold over Iwo Jima, a volcanic island barely 8 square miles in area, located 650 miles from Tokyo. The island possessed critical strategic value: 3 airfields that could support fighter escorts for B-29 bombers attacking Japan, emergency landing facilities for damaged bombers, and a forward base for the eventual invasion of the home islands. 21,000 Japanese defenders under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months transforming Iwo Jima into perhaps the most formidable fortress in military history. Kuribayashi, understanding that his forces could not prevent an American landing, abandoned traditional Japanese tactics of defending at the water's edge and suicidal banzai charges. Instead, he created a defense in depth utilizing Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain. His engineers excavated 11 miles of interconnecting tunnels, hundreds of reinforced pillboxes, and artillery positions carefully camouflaged and mutually supporting. Kuribayashi instructed his garrison that each man must kill 10 Americans before dying, calculating that such casualties might convince the United States to negotiate peace rather than invade Japan proper. The American assault began with a naval and aerial bombardment unprecedented in Pacific warfare. 3 days of sustained shelling that delivered 40,000 shells onto the tiny island. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, believed no fortifications could survive such punishment. The bombardment barely scratched Kuribayashi's underground fortress. When 30,000 Marines of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed on the morning of February 19th, Japanese defenders emerged from tunnels and bunkers, unleashing carefully aimed fire that transformed the black volcanic sand beaches into killing zones. Marines struggled inland through volcanic ash that provided no secure footing and concealment for neither attackers nor cover. Japanese artillery and mortar fire poured down from Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano dominating Iwo Jima's southern tip, and from the highlands in the island's center. Casualties mounted with shocking speed. More than 500 Marines fell on the first day. The expected quick victory transformed into a 36-day battle of attrition, where every yard required dynamite, flamethrowers, and close-quarters combat. On February 23rd, 4 days into the battle, Marines fought their way to Suribachi's summit. A patrol led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreer raised a small American flag atop the mountain. Hours later, a larger flag replaced it in a moment, captured by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. His photograph of 6 Marines struggling to raise the flag became the most iconic image of World War II, symbolizing American determination and sacrifice. 3 of the 6 flag raisers would die before Iwo Jima was secured. The battle's cost exceeded all previous Pacific operations. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than for any other single battle in American history. Marine casualties approached 27,000, with over 6,800 killed. Navy corpsmen suffered devastating losses trying to save wounded Marines under fire. The Japanese garrison fought with suicidal dedication. Barely 200 of Kuribayashi's original 21,000 defenders survived to be captured. General Kuribayashi himself disappeared during the final days of fighting, his body never positively identified. Military historians debated whether Iwo Jima's capture justified its terrible cost. Proponents argued that over 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima's airfields before the war ended, saving approximately 25,000 air crewmen who would otherwise have ditched in the ocean. Critics maintained that Japan's defeat was inevitable by February 1945, making such casualties unnecessary. The debate continues today, though it provided no comfort to the families of men who died on that sulfurous volcanic rock. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, saw the launch of Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater. Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, represented the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan proper. The island's capture would provide staging areas, airfields, and harbors necessary for Operation Downfall, the planned assault on Kyushu and Honshu. Both sides understood Okinawa represented the war's penultimate battle, fighting with corresponding desperation. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, numbered approximately 110,000 defenders, regular Army troops, conscripted Okinawan militia, and student volunteers. Ushijima adopted tactics perfected at Iwo Jima, constructing a defense in depth that utilized Okinawa's southern region, honeycombed with caves, escarpments, and ancient tombs converted into fortified positions. The Shuri Line, anchored on ridges and valleys offering interlocking fields of fire, would exact a horrifying toll from American attackers. The invasion force totaled over 180,000 troops, Army and Marine divisions that would swell to over 500,000 personnel by battle's end. The initial landings on the Hagushi beaches met virtually no resistance, an eerily quiet beginning that lulled nobody. General Simon Bolivar Buckner's 10th Army advanced inland quickly, securing the central airfields within days. Marines wheeled north, clearing the island's northern region within 2 weeks. But the drive south toward Shuri Castle entered hell itself. American forces crashed against Japanese defensive lines like waves against a stone cliff. The Kakazu Ridge, Conical Hill, Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon Ridge, names now inscribed in military history, became synonyms for brutal, grinding combat. Rain transformed the battlefield into a swamp where tanks bogged down and wounded men drowned in flooded shell craters. The stench of death became inescapable. Soldiers and Marines developed 1,000-yard stares, psychologically shattered by prolonged exposure to combat's horrors. Psychiatric casualties approached 25% in some units. Japanese forces unleashed massed kamikaze attacks against the American fleet supporting the invasion, sinking 36 ships and damaging 368 others. The destroyer USS Laffey survived 22 separate kamikaze and bomb attacks in 80 minutes on April 16th, her crew fighting fires and manning guns even as sections of the ship disappeared in explosions. Thousands of sailors died in these attacks, nearly 5,000 naval casualties, more than the entire Marine Corps suffered at Iwo Jima. Radar picket destroyers stationed around Okinawa bore the brunt, serving as early warning stations that became targets themselves. Okinawan civilians caught between two armies suffered catastrophically. Japanese propaganda convinced many that Americans would commit atrocities against prisoners. Military authorities forced civilians from protective caves to make room for soldiers, exposing them to artillery fire. Others were killed by Japanese troops to prevent surrender or eliminate potential security risks. Conservative estimates place Okinawan civilian deaths at 40,000 to 150,000. The true number remains unknown. Entire families committed suicide rather than face capture. Tragedies repeated from Saipan. The battleground, on through May and into June. General Buckner, criticized for his methodical approach, died from artillery fire on June 18th, among the highest-ranking American officers killed by enemy fire during the war. 4 days later, General Ushijima committed ritual suicide in his final command post, recognizing his defense had failed. Organized resistance ended June 22, 1945, 82 days after the invasion began. Okinawa's cost exceeded every previous Pacific battle. American casualties approached 50,000, with over 12,000 killed. The Japanese 32nd Army was annihilated. Only 7,000 of the original garrison survived. The battle's brutality, the fanatical Japanese resistance, the civilian casualties, and the kamikaze attacks convinced American planners that invading Japan proper would result in casualties measured in hundreds of thousands or millions. Summer 1945 found Japan in desperate circumstances yet unwilling to surrender unconditionally. The island-hopping campaign had severed the home islands from conquered territories, strangling Japan's access to food, fuel, and raw materials. American submarines operated freely in Japanese waters, sinking any vessel brave or foolish enough to leave port. B-29 bombers launched from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam conducted regular raids that incinerated Japanese cities. The March 9th through 10th firebombing of Tokyo killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would later claim. Yet Japan's military leadership refused to accept defeat. The concept of unconditional surrender contradicted fundamental aspects of Japanese culture and military honor. Army hardliners, particularly those who had never witnessed Pacific battlefields, convinced themselves that Japan could inflict such terrible casualties on invading American forces that acceptable peace terms could be negotiated. They prepared Operation Ketsugo, decisive battle, positioning over 2 million troops, thousands of aircraft, and countless civilians trained with bamboo spears to resist the expected American landings. American planners completing Operation Downfall projections confronted sobering casualty estimates. The invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1, 1945, would involve 14 divisions, 766,000 combat troops. The subsequent assault on Honshu's Kanto Plain, planned for March 1946, would require even greater forces. Casualty projections varied wildly, but even conservative estimates suggested hundreds of thousands of American dead and wounded. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would reach millions as the population fought a desperate last stand. The Manhattan Project, developed in absolute secrecy at a cost of $2 billion, offered an alternative to Operation Downfall. Scientists working at Los Alamos, New Mexico under J. Robert Oppenheimer had successfully tested an atomic weapon on July 16, 1945. The explosion, equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, released destructive power beyond anything previously witnessed. President Harry Truman, who had inherited the presidency upon Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, faced the decision of whether to employ this revolutionary weapon against Japanese cities. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The weapon detonated at precisely 8:15 in the morning local time, creating a fireball that reached several million degrees and winds exceeding 600 miles per hour. The blast and thermal radiation killed approximately 70,000 people instantly, with total deaths eventually reaching 140,000 as radiation sickness claimed additional victims. Approximately 69% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed. Japan's military leadership, even confronted with Hiroshima's annihilation, argued for continuing the war. Some questioned whether America possessed additional atomic weapons. Others insisted Japanese spirit could overcome any material advantage. The Soviet Union's declaration of war on August 8th, launching massive offensives into Manchuria, potentially influenced Japanese thinking more than the atomic bomb. Stalin's entry into the Pacific War eliminated any hope of Soviet mediation for negotiated peace terms. On August 9th, a second B-29, Boxcar, dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki when weather conditions prevented bombing the primary target of Kokura. The plutonium bomb killed approximately 40,000 people immediately, with eventual deaths reaching 70,000. Emperor Hirohito, breaking imperial precedent, directly intervened to end the debate among military leaders, recording a radio address announcing Japan's acceptance of Allied surrender terms. The broadcast, delivered in formal court Japanese incomprehensible to many listeners, aired on August 15th, bringing World War II to its conclusion. The island-hopping campaign, from Guadalcanal's jungles to Okinawa's ridges, had crushed Japanese expansion through systematic application of American industrial power, tactical innovation, and the courage of men who fought for obscure patches of coral and volcanic rock. The strategy bypassed fortified positions, severed supply lines, and advanced American power 7,000 miles across the Pacific in less than 4 years. Over 111,000 American servicemen died in the Pacific theater, with hundreds of thousands wounded. Japanese military deaths approached 2 million, civilian casualties perhaps exceeded that number. The campaign transformed warfare itself, pioneering amphibious assault techniques, demonstrating strategic bombing's devastating effectiveness, and ultimately introducing atomic weapons whose shadow extends into present times. Those volcanic islands, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, stand as monuments to a generation that fought the Pacific War, crushing an empire through battles whose ferocity matched anything in human history.